This is the Fundamental Escape Podcast with your host, Mark Fitzgerald. I'm David Werba, and this is episode 2. Mark, you had a talk with Doug Pagitt, who's a speaker, a pastor, and an author of several books, including his latest, Flipped, which is available at his website, and we'll include that in the podcast notes. So tell me, Mark, what led you to find Doug?
Yeah, it was really funny, actually. I was in a bit of an interesting place in my spiritual journey, so I had a number of questions and doubts about some of the core ideas that I was handed growing up, and I had a friend of mine who used to talk to me quite often about this thing called the emergent church, and I was like, emergent? What does this mean, And so he would talk to me about it, and he would always talk about it in a negative light, and after a while I got very curious. I was like, I want to know what this is all about. It was like my curiosity got the better of me. So one of the names that kept cropping up was Doug Pagitt. And so I tracked down his book called Christianity Worth Believing. And there were some ideas in that book. We actually touched on them in the podcast. So it was really, really interesting. So they helped me quite a lot and shaped a lot of my views that I guess I still hold to today, and so it was a really great opportunity to have the chance to talk to Doug. So yeah, that's how I came across him and his work. So
yeah, just like Kevin Miller, Doug is very well spoken and articulate. I enjoyed listening to all the points he made, really. And there's one in particular, his analogy that compared churchgoers from competing churches to rabid fans of professional sports teams. We have to talk more about that in another episode. But for now, here's the interview.
Yeah, cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Fundamental Escape podcast. My guest today is Doug Pagitt. Do you want to introduce yourself there, Doug?
Yeah. Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm pastor of a church that I started 15 years ago called Solomon's Porch. And I do a bunch of organizing and networking of just and generous Christians around North America through an organization called Convergence. And then I also write books and all the rest of that. That's all my personal life. And I'm married and have 4 adult children now. And I'm also an ultra marathon runner, which is something I think an awful lot about on an awful lot of days.
Something I will never be.
You never know.
Oh, maybe.
You never know. I see everybody like, the Apostle Paul being the great enemy of the Christian faith, and then he becomes the great apostle.
Yeah.
So
I actually heard you, I think it was you were speaking at Mars Hill. You were talking about your running there.
Yeah.
I think, I actually listened to a podcast of that. So I guess to kick off, a pretty interesting place to begin. As I say, I almost didn't sort of bring this up with you because I wasn't sure how it would sort of come across. But I guess one of the ways that I connected, I guess to back up a few steps, as people who know me know that I was, I grew up in a fairly conservative environment, like Christianity, wise, I suppose, I ended up getting involved with street evangelism for about 5 years. So that was a big part of my life. I was, very evangelistic, and, I came across the ministry of Ray Comfort, who ran a TV show, which was a radio show as well, called Way of the Master Radio. And that's one of the places where I came across yourself in an interesting exchange with Todd Friel, who was the host of that radio show. And so basically after about sort of 5 years of doing evangelism, I completely burnt out, to put it bluntly. It was, really intense. And as I say, I was a very black and white person and, saw the world in a very strict way and didn't really ask too many questions, just went along with, everything that I was handed growing up and things like that. And after that happened, after that sort of burnout phase, I sort of had a lot of questions and a lot of doubts. And, I genuinely didn't know if my faith could hold up after that sort of experience, because I was like, when you sort of go through a time like that, your whole world changes and you can't sort of, you can't rebuild with the same bricks because they're all kind of crumbled and smashed. And so long story short, I did come across this interview. I think it was about close to 20 minutes long, I think it was. Someone had posted it on YouTube. And how do we even begin explaining this conversation? It's one of the most interesting exchanges I've ever come across. So, do you maybe you could sort of kick off? I'd be interested in, like, first of all, how did it come about, them getting you on the show?
Well, I'd written a book. I was actually the editor of a book that was talking about different emerging voices in Christianity in North America. And when you're releasing a book, you tend to do a lot of radio interviews, right? And you'll sort of take an interview with pretty much anybody that you can find who would talk to you about your book, and that's true for just about every author, So. So the publicist had sent a book to Todd Friel, and he's part of a fundamentalist
Very
religious sect in Christianity, and they somehow, that group knew about some of the work that I've done and some of the public stances I've taken and so on. So they knew who I was. I didn't know who they were.
Yeah, you said that in the interview. You actually did say that at one point. You're like, I have no idea who you are. Like you.
Yeah. Well, and the call came in, I can't remember all the details, but I remember it coming in a bit early, and I wasn't quite home yet. And I sort of grabbed the phone, or the call on the car while driving home. And it was just a little banter at the beginning. And what's funny about that interview, if your listeners were to go back and listen to it, it's pretty intense.
Yeah.
And before the interview started, Todd was on the line. He's like, "Hey, man, really great to have you. Really glad. Thanks a lot." And just really genuine and friendly. Then as soon as the show starts, his voice shifts.
Is this
He
game
takes
on?
he takes on a totally different persona. And I sort of get it, that because I've run a radio show and stuff too. So I get it that, people have their radio voices. But this is much more of a caricature even than just sort of his radio voice. And then after the interview ends, he comes back on and goes, "Hey, thanks a lot, man. That was really great. I think people are really going to like that." I just frankly, and I'd be glad to say this right to him too, I just think he's insincere. I mean, I think he's really pulling the legs of people, and he's just doing it's a bit like, I think, and this is true, I think, of a lot of fundamentalist sects in Christianity, that they really treat it much more. I mean, there might be people like you who feel yourself to be a true adherent and fully sucked in and everything. But a lot of these guys, frankly, I just think they operate much more like characters in a professional wrestling television, where the fans are more committed to what they're saying and yelling and doing than they are as a performer.
Yeah.
And so I think they've kind of turned it into sport in that sense.
Yeah.
And professional athletes are the same way. They'll often be very collegial with players from other teams, where fans can't find themselves even wanting to talk to fans from another team. I think this is really true in religion as well as in sport and other things, that sometimes the people who are kind of watching it are far more rabid and separatistic than the people who are deeply involved. So it was a very bizarre interaction. But basically, they were, and I get these kind of conversations a lot. That I think Todd and some others came from a tradition that said that the particular fundamentals have to be met for someone to be a Christian. So what he was really trying to do was trying to determine if I was, by his standards, legitimately Christian or not. And then if I'm not legitimately Christian in actuality, but I proclaim myself to be, then you have a category for that called being a false teacher or a heretic or somebody else, right? So someone who claims to be something that they're not. So it was a conversation primarily about hell and primarily about the afterlife. And at a couple of points, in the interview, if you remember, I made this point like, hey, if this is the way this is going to go, I don't have any interest in this.
You said that quite early on, actually.
Yeah.
And then, this is just not a helpful conversation.
It's just not helpful. And I was feeling myself, I don't know if in New Zealand you saw the old TV show, The Hulk, but I felt myself kind of getting this rage going. Like I was just getting mad. And then at one point I was ending the conversation, and then I felt myself ramp back up. And I'm like, I think this guy actually truly, I don't think he has a decent cosmology. Like, I think he thinks heaven is a location.
Yeah,
And I think he might I think he might have an early Copernican view of the
yeah,
Earth and outer space. Like, these people are just,
yeah.
this is unbelievable.
Can you?
So then we get into this weird conversation
Yeah.
about if I would baptize or if I would
Oh yeah. Speak of the
oversee a
funeral of a
funeral of
Muslim.
a Muslim.
Yeah.
Like, and this is the thing about fundamentalism, and you probably know it far better than I do because I've only experienced it sort of from an outsider and a victim of its vitriol. But like the level to which somebody can come up with a new set of tests to see if you pass that test or not. Like somehow for Todd, overseeing or being a participant in a funeral of someone would
Yeah.
mean that you aren't actually Christian. Like
Yeah.
it's just
But
so
here's
strange.
the deal. Here's my take on it. From
Yeah.
as I say, I'm talking as someone who was directly involved with the ideas of his ministry. You were disqualified in his mind from the beginning before you had said a word.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there was you didn't have a chance. There was no way that you said a lot of things on that call, and I think what I'll do is I'll post the links to it in the description of
Oh, that'd
the
be good. Yeah,
podcast,
sure. Yeah.
so people can get a reference point. But yeah, like you just had no chance. Like you were disqualified, and he was simply asking these very leading questions to get you to say anything where he could go, oh, I've got you. Like it was just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
I was going to
Really
ask
funny.
you. I was actually going to ask if you could clarify a little bit on that, because I'll be honest with you. Like I don't fully understand everything you were saying about the whole like place kind of thing, like the whole
Yeah.
because I guess I've grown up in that worldview. Like I'd be interested if you could maybe clarify that a little bit.
Okay. So whatever. Like his question was, where does a person go when they die?
Yeah,
And it's such a poorly phrased question in English, right? Just at the most base level, and it really shows to me that someone hasn't really thought about the question that they're asking very seriously, right? Because location is 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 not what anyone's getting at who speaks about the afterlife. Right. So if someone's speaking about, let's say someone believes that there's an eternal hell that a person is in, that's not a where, right? Maybe what someone's getting at is in what state would a person's conscious soul find itself?
yeah,
Okay, what state? But it's not a location because afterlife means, if people hold to this sort of thing, that your
like
spirit
non-material.
your spirit is now non-material.
Yeah,
And so you can't have location of non-materiality. It just doesn't. So when someone asks that kind of question, and they don't mean it as sort of a generality to have a conversation about what you think about the justice and love of God, but they actually mean where does someone go, and they don't know that they're asked that they're talking about anything else. I think it really shows a kind of a lack of sophistication in that question that
yeah,
that a person who's thought deeply about such things out of the Bible and out of the teachings of Jesus cannot have a legitimate response to.
yeah,
Like the statement of Jesus to the prisoner, where I am going, you can go, or in my Father's house, there's much room, and if it wasn't so, I would have told you. Or the place I'm going, you can follow, like he says to Thomas. Well, okay, all of those statements are not they're not statements about a location, right? So, in other words, Jesus wasn't saying to Thomas when he says, "Where I'm going, you can follow." He's not saying I'm going up to that hill, and that's going to be the location where you can come with me. He's saying the state that I'm moving into, the place of sacrifice of sacrificing all of my intentions to the will and the life of God.
Yeah.
That state one finds themselves in is the place. It's not a location, right? And if someone thinks that Jesus has been speaking about location in all of his gospels, when he's talking about the kingdom of God, and he's talking about the light and the love of life, you're going to end up with a really different gospel if you think that's speaking about a place, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it just doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So now I think there's actually a much bigger question behind all of that, and that is that conversations about the afterlife are really the least, one of the things that we are least prepared to talk about as people. Human beings have no capacity to speak about the afterlife in anything but sort of imaginary and wishful desires, right? No one, because the human experience for all of us, even people I would declare who write books that say they've experienced otherwise, I think every human being's experience has been limited to the memories and the experiences that they have had in their body.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whatever happens to a human being after death, we don't have access to that
It's
information.
still speculation at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, so we can only speak about it in terms that recognize that.
Yeah.
And this kind of where is someone going to go language just really shows that someone is not taking that very seriously by my
Yeah. Yeah.
estimations. And especially if you try to use Jesus as if Jesus's comments were about heaven being in one location and hell being in another.
Yeah.
And that somehow, I mean, I knew in that conversation with him, it was off the rails once I was hearing from him very clearly that Jesus is quite pleased and happy that some people would go to hell. Like that is so far outside the Gospels, and I think the Christian message that it's just stunning to me.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Oh,
so
definitely.
we're really talking we're talking about really different
Yeah.
structures and belief systems.
Yeah, I was actually keen to jump into that kind of conversation maybe a little bit later. That whole idea of, the different stories that we believe, and the result that comes from those beliefs, But just to wrap up, I mean, obviously we could I don't want to spend a whole conversation talking about this
Yeah,
phone
right.
call with Todd.
Sure.
But there was one point that I wanted to I thought it was quite funny. There was a point in the conversation where you both kind of had this moment where he started getting confused. Like he was like, what is it? What, and you kind of both laughed. It was like really funny. There's just this one point where you're just like, what? And it was literally like two people talking completely different languages,
Yes.
And
Yes.
I mean, in a sense, that's what it was, because you come from completely different places in your understanding. So in that by that way of conversation ending, I was going to just sort of ask you if you could, and I know people do get asked all the time to sort of sum up the emergent church and things, but to the uninitiated, how would you could you go into a few sort of basic details, I guess, of how you form together with some of the other leaders that are known as emergent church leaders and things, or?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to give you a little background on that. So a lot of us what we were trying to pursue back in the late 1990s, especially, and then into the early 2000s. This is now starting to talk, this is starting to sound like old man talk, right? It's like 20 years ago kind of
Back
thing.
in my day.
Yeah, back in the day before there was so many of us, what we were trying to figure out was where would the kind of Christianity or faith that we had experienced, where was that leading us, right? So to really understand kind of emerging church conversation, you kind of have to recognize that there are an awful lot of people who feel like faith is and the Christian gospel is always opening up and growing more expansively through time, right? As opposed to that it's fixed at one place in history, or worse yet, that it's closing and becoming more and more narrow and restrictive. So for a lot of us, I mean, that was driven out of our understanding of go into Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, right? This Christian call, and then you see the church in the early years of the apostles spreading through those very areas, the inclusion of the Gentiles, the opening up of the gospel and including more people in more places in more varying ways and means through time. And then for the next 2,000 years of history, you can see Christianity expressing itself differently all over the world. And while there be some particular streams that seem to be similar to one another around the world, the Orthodox Church and then the Roman Church and the Anabaptist traditions, and then some of the Reformers come along, and then the Pentecostal expressions come into being. And so there become all these different kind of big streams. But Christianity all over the world for all time, from Jesus forward, and I would even go back into the Hebrew communities, into the Israelites, into the early Judeans at the time of Jesus, is a continuously opening story, which I actually root in Jesus saying, if in my Father's house there were not many rooms, I would have told you. Like, if this was a limited storyline that we were in, I would have told you it's just us and not them. But I say to you, the whole world is implicated in the story of the gospel. And so the belief is that for a lot of us, that the gospel is always opening up and always including more and more people, and therefore expressing itself in varying ways with new and fresh understandings in different cultural circumstances. So what a lot of us are we're talking about in the emerging church language is what is now emerging in culture and in Christianity that helps us to understand a way of faith for those of us living in the early 20th or early 21st century or late 20th century in North American culture, and what are other people seeing around the world. So what we were trying to do, and are still up to, an awful lot of us, is to find explanations and access to the expression of Christian faith as it's happening in different people groups around the world.
Yeah.
So that's what emerging church is really about. So then you're going to have changing theologies, you're going to have changing practices, you're going to have changing pedagogy, or how people learn and experience.
Yeah.
So you're going to have change in all of those areas. Yeah. And that really sits counter to fundamentalists, right? Like, at its core center, it is the opposite of what fundamentalists say. Yeah. And this has been this expansive and fundamentalist argument has been going on a long time. I think you see it really clearly in the New Testament. I think you see it in the Gospels. You know, in the Gospels, one of the battlegrounds of this is, I think Jesus and Jesus's community is the kingdom of God is among you, expanding story. It's small as a mustard seed, but will grow and grow and grow. And then you have the fundamentalist response to that of the religious structure of the day that says, no, we already know, it's already been given. So I've written this book called Flipped, which is the title is based off Jesus saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you, right? And so I would say that the expansive view of the gospel is rooted in the path of Jesus in that way, and that fundamentalists are rooted in this storyline of no, we have already heard it said, and that settles it. Yeah. So when you hear people argue, you know, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, whether they use those exact words or just that impulse, I think they're sitting in opposition to Jesus' call. And then you see it, of course, in the New Testament church with Paul and the Jewish community in Jerusalem, the Judaizers that don't want the Gentiles to be included. And then you see it with Augustine, he redoes it. And then you see it rebranded with some of the Reformers and what they do. And you see the repeating of, there is a right and pure group, and the story that we have is the only one anyone should have. And so the emerging church movement in the 20th and 21st century has sat in. So we're not picking necessarily a single theological line. You know, lots of people are involved in the movement with me. We think really differently about so many things. We think differently theologically, and we think differently ecclesiologically, but what we have in common.
Would you say that, and this is something I talked with Kevin Miller about on the Hellbound episode I talked about the idea of position versus disposition, meaning a lot of, like you say, sort of in fundamentalist ideology, it's about, what is your position? What do you believe, kind of thing. Whereas the idea of disposition is saying, well, how do you hold your beliefs? How do you conduct yourself?
Yes.
And this seems to me one of the disconnects. And this is where I'd be interested to hopefully, it may be a venture that's in vain, but I would like to sort of create some conversation that can connect some dots for some people, and hopefully what would you feel from your experience are some of the biggest misconceptions that you feel are out there in regards to emergent Christianity?
Well, I think one of the big misconceptions is that there's some commonality of belief. I really like your category there of your belief versus your disposition. So there's people who just think that it's really about differing on a particular view. So everyone sort of thinks the same on these things. And I have a bunch of emerging church friends who still hold to a view of hell that would be totally different than what our view of the afterlife, including hell, would be totally different than the way that I understand the gospel's proclamation.
Yeah.
And that's not a dividing point for us. So it drives people crazy, right? Because they think that that people are just making a new religion, and we're really talking about one of the differences in how people believe, not just in what they believe. So I think that's a big one, and it all depends. There's an awful lot of people who hear the emerging language and they recognize it through its ecclesiology, right? So like a lot of people's critique of me and others is that we don't use power in the way that a lot of either fundamentalists or even liberal Christians use power. Like me and the tribe I run around with, we have sort of an Anabaptist-like vibe to us, right? Where everyone's an equal and everyone gets to contribute equally, and people may have different abilities and skills and passions, but we all are equal in this, and no pastor is greater than anyone who's not a pastor. Well, man, there's as much pushback about that as there is about anything else, right? Like someone being ordained to preach, or someone, in other parts of the religious tradition, who are ordained to distribute the elements. I give as much hackles and trouble to my friends who utilize ordination as a limit as I do to my conservative friends who use theology as a limit. Like to make someone's belief a separator for them from God or from your community is among the more, it just seems to me to be ridiculous and cruel things to do to somebody. Because the one thing I know about people's beliefs is you are not culpable or fully responsible for all of your beliefs. I mean, none of us are. Beliefs, we end up living with our own beliefs and stories that are in our head. And we end up wrestling with those, and we try to come to grips with what we believe far more than we're responsible for them. I mean, nobody's like, hey, I just decided to believe that. That's just not
It's
accurate.
almost like immersion, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, think of any belief that's meaningful to you in your life, and just say, well, you know what, tomorrow I'm just going to stop believing that. Well, no, you're not actually just going to stop believing that because you decided to. So to hold someone responsible for the thoughts that are in their head, that is just really, it's unhelpful to them and to anyone else, and it's really quite cruel. So I think that's part of the struggle, I think, for a lot of people in understanding what some of us are talking about is what's the fabric that makes up this new thing that we should be into. And more than the new thing, as you brought up, it's more a way of approaching life and faith and people and belief than it is.
I mean, I suppose from a sort of a strictly fundamental position, you can have, it puts all that focus on basically having all your beliefs lined up intellectually, and you can be completely orthodox in your mind, but your character can be completely misaligned. Like, you can be a total jerk.
Totally. Yeah,
it,
no,
it, it makes no
it's
sense.
brutal.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's brutal, and the number of stories we tell ourselves about how we believe, right, is like I was welcomed into Christianity by very generous evangelicals, and they tended to come from the profession of faith stream of Christianity. So for me, um, I can mark my beginning of Christianity at a very specific point when I made a declaration to live in the way of Jesus. And I was like a 16-year-old, and I remember that day still, and like it's clear, right? There was a day where it started. But the story that gets told around that by a whole religious community, as if there was a moment right there when God's view of me changed in some ontological way, in some core
Yeah,
foundational
yeah, yeah,
way, that now the attitude of God toward me became something
yeah,
that it wasn't previously. That because my brain used its chemical and electrical interactions
you
for me
affected the
to
divine.
conclude a thought.
Yeah,
I mean, you're talking about somebody who if you changed a few words in there, it would really sound like magic and incantations,
yeah,
right? That
yeah, yeah,
someone whipped up a magic potion or a
yeah,
magic spell and caused a deity to change the deity's constitution toward a person. That's a little,
yeah,
now you don't, to a kid that's going to go to summer camp this summer and is going to, sing, "I have decided to follow Jesus." You don't need to go into their life and start telling them that really all they're doing is whipping up a bunch of incantations, because to the
yeah,
lived experience of that kid, they're like, no, this is a real declaration. I'm really going to go live my life to follow Jesus in the world,
yeah,
right? What I would get at is that's really meaningful and really powerful. I don't hold a view that says, and now God is no longer displeased with you, and now you're God's child. Now you pick your religious system, either forever or until you don't live up to that, or until you know, uh,
find a better one. Or
yeah,
yeah,
think a bad thought or touch a wrong body part in
yeah, yeah,
yourself. Right?
yeah. No, it's interesting that whole sort of. I don't know. I suppose our tendency is to, like, when we make these kind of transitional moves from one place to another place. I know Rob Bell talks about this quite a bit. That whole idea of how we want to drag everyone across with us, like we're just like, this is the way. Come on, this is just follow me. And
Yeah.
I had an interesting conversation with a friend yesterday, and he's someone who's really struggled with the whole like feeling condemned and like feeling like he's going to hell and all this kind of real heavy stuff. And I've really tried to sort of get alongside him and encourage him, and he's in a sort of interesting place at the moment where he seems to be in a reasonably sort of what I'd say is fundamental, I guess, mind frame, and at the same time, I wasn't going to turn around and start going, oh, forget all that, just follow what I'm doing and read these books, and it just
Yeah.
doesn't work like that. And I think that was another sort of question I was going to bring up was, I mean, since the emergent church has obviously sort of been around for quite a few years now, like what would you say are some of the key, like, I mean, I guess mistakes or lessons that you've learned through the questioning process and through the like reimagining of the gospel, I guess you could say, and different sort of things. Like, what would you say has come through over that period of time?
Yeah, I don't know that I could speak I mean, the when you take the approach to the church that's emerging in North America, from my context, or around the world, like it's so consistent and so vast and happening in so many places that none of us we weren't speaking about it sort of as a noun. We were speaking about it more as a verb, that the church is emerging.
Yeah,
And so it's
right, yeah,
emerging out of all kinds of contexts. So rather than it being a particular expression that did some things right and some things not so right, it's continuously
okay. So what are
happening.
you learning? What are you personally learning?
So what is really common in all of these different expressions is that you can't. It's really dangerous to sort of half open the can, right? Like once you start unraveling that can, to quit early, or to not keep going in your process of rethinking and consideration can really put people in a difficult situation. So I know an awful lot of people who have started to sort of rework and reimagine their theology or their ecclesiology or their anthropology or their cosmology or whatever, however it starts, right? Whatever sort of frame of mind and reference and explanation they're going after, that starts them, and then they stop. So if you end up, say, with a changed ecclesiology, but you won't change or meaning the view of a church and what it means to be a Christian community or church community, your ecclesiology, but you don't keep pressing through what it means to think differently theologically about God, you end up in a really difficult spot because you're sort of out of balance, right? You've sort of partly.
So they're all connected at the end of the day, really.
Yeah, you really have to keep going. And there's an awful lot of people who have gotten into some kind of new thinking and deconstructing and kind of remaking or reimagining. And they find themselves like feeling a little trapped, like, oh my gosh, everything is up in the air now. It's really, I don't know, maybe you've even felt that way.
Totally. I had, just to kind of go back on, sort of where I came into, reading emergent books and things, it was, two books I read early on was A Generous Orthodoxy by Brian McLaren and the A Christianity Worth Believing by yourself. And the two ideas I guess to point out from those two books, I guess, that I really appreciated was, being that sort of evangelistic person that I am, in the beginning of Generous Orthodoxy, Brian McLaren basically says, he says, maybe you've been told that there's no room for you within the faith. And he says, I'm here to tell you that there is. And then he goes, but maybe I'm naive. And he was just very candid in that book, very open. And it was very refreshing, And then the idea that I took from your book was that idea, and I think you talk about it in Flipped as well, is that idea of God being present, this, I can't remember exactly what you call it, the up and out God or the down and in God sort of thing. Yeah. And that concept to me was really radical at the time. I was like, man, God's with us, like he's present, like far out. Right. And, because again, I'd come through the system where God was on the other side of the table and we were constantly having to please him. And I suppose this can, given that, the last episode we did talk quite in depth about hell and things, and, I would be keen if you wanted to elaborate on that, but that whole idea of the story that we find ourselves in, and, Brian McLaren sort of deconstructs that, in his New Kind of Christianity, the whole 6-line Greco-Roman narrative, Mm-hmm. And I just sort of wonder, like, how can we hold to this idea of life being good and have joy and peace and all this kind of good stuff with this kind of horror story hanging over us of this pending judgment. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's crazy.
I do.
Like, the first question I asked Kevin Miller in that podcast was, I said, do you actually believe that Christians believe in hell? And he was like, no. He goes, of course they don't. If they did, they would live completely different lives. Yeah. So I was just interested in your kind of take on that, and like the importance of story. I do have some thoughts on that.
I was in an interview. I was in a debate a couple of years ago with some people who are thinking a lot about hell, and they used a debate format. So an actual, like, you sit on a stage, you have two debaters, you do opening statements.
Fun.
you do okay. So they use that means of having a conversation, and the people who invited me were sort of, they were nice and open and sort of generous about it, but they were clearly on the other side of it. So I was the only one kind of in the room who wasn't holding to hell, and it was a very interesting endeavor to be in. The person who was the other debater, and you can watch these on YouTube and Vimeo if you want to watch the debates. They're kind of something else, but his name is Chris Roseborough. I don't know if you know that name, but he's sort of part of that of a similar tribe of people that Todd Friel and some others are part of. And so Chris's opening salvo to the group, was, hey, when I was telling people that, I was going to be part of this debate with Doug, my friends said, give them hell. And, everybody laughed, right? So then when I started my part, I basically said what Kevin reflected to you, to the crowd, which was, that's kind of an interesting way to start this. If you consider what we're talking about here and the ramifications, if Chris is right, it seems a little inappropriate that someone would use that as a laugh line.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And people, we talked a lot about that after it was over and people went out to eat dinner together and stuff. And there were some who I know that really shook them, right? The fact that, hey, if I really think this means that 70% of the human population, including people I've loved, are going to be in, conscious, unstopping torment for all of eternity, would I really laugh at that, let alone be sitting here like I am, or somehow believing that maybe if we stop gay marriage from happening in the United States, that's going to do it? Like, really? It really doesn't make sense. But as I realized, and I think Kevin's right, no, people don't believe in that. But as it turns out, the people that I know for whom hell is a really big deal, and they really believe in it, and it matters to them, that the reason they believe it is more important than what they believe. And this has been one of the things I've realized in the last, 5 or 10 years, is that it's far more interesting and important to know why someone believes what they believe rather than what they believe. So the degree to which someone can have some functionality of the belief that they're keeping in place and they're continuing to prop up, even though they're not totally responsible for it, what function does it have in their life, and why do they keep giving it water and keep it alive? That's really meaningful. And what I realized over the course of this debate was what they're terrified of losing is that there would be any judgment at all for wrongdoing, for sin, or for whatever word you want to use. If you use the kind of language that I like to use about disintegration with God. So if there's no alternative, if there's no alternative story to the evil being done in the world, then aren't we kind of missing something? Because people want there to be an alternative to the evil that's done in the world. So they hold to hell because that is maybe immature, sort of childlike, response to, I hope God's the good guy who goes and gets the bad guys who do the bad things.
So it's like a justice impulse almost. It's
a justice impulse. Yeah, I think that's a great way to say it. So when you take hell away from someone, and this is what happens, this is why I was saying that if you don't go all the way, you can really end up kind of half caught in trouble. Is if you just remove consequence and you don't do something about, well, then what is justice? Boy, people end up in a really bad spot. And if you've had bad things happen to you, or if you have deep empathy for the horror that has been inflicted on other people in the world, you really want there to be some way that that's dealt with in the world. You don't want it to just sort of be seen as unimportant or unmet. So I think it's incumbent on some of us who hold to a non-retributive God to answer the question, well, then what happens with all that stuff?
Yeah.
We shouldn't get to dodge the question just because somebody else's suggestion about what happens to all of that seems insufficient. I don't think it's enough for most people to just say, oh, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I have this little continuum in my head.
Well, I remembered listening to Peter Rollins was talking about, the whole sort of debacle with Rob Bell's Love Wins, and he was basically saying how the vehement disagreement that came from the evangelical church, basically he's like, it doesn't signal disagreement, but what it signals is the fact that he brought to light an issue that people were too afraid to talk about, basically.
Yes.
Because he's like,
Yeah.
what did the Amish do when the book came out? I was like, they did nothing. They just kept building their barns.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
He broke the veil,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
For a lot of people who then said,
yeah,
oh, there's somebody that
yeah,
I want to listen to. And look, this is one of the reasons too why some people think very badly of guys like Rob and Brian, and I'll be bold and throw myself in that same category, is because we carry with us the evangelical pedigree. So evangelicals got up in arms about that.
yeah,
None of those same people cared what liberals, in their minds, or a bunch of, Episcopalians or Anglicans thought about that stuff. They're just
but you're
like,
one of us, It's
who
like,
cares?
yeah,
Yeah, it's when you're someone in your own, self-declared tribe. So it's really a big deal, right? I mean, it doesn't mean it's a worse kind of wrongdoing or sin. Like a lot of people think an abomination is like ultra bad sin, somehow. But I think it really means that deep. That deep violation of a cultural set of expectations. So in a lot of ways, what Jesus is accused of is committing an abomination. So the reason that the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law are comfortable in the Gospels, at least the way the narratives tell it, to turn against Jesus, to have him put to death by the Romans, is because he just continues to violate cultural norms to such a degree that he's creating an alternative culture. And in that, they will lose the culture of early Judean culture, what we would, sort of like our modern day Judaism, but it was a different expression, of course, at the time.
Yeah. I suppose in sort of way of kind of winding down a little bit, one of the key things I wanted to talk about, and I've got a friend of mine. He's basically discovered some of the authors and things that I'm reading, and he's like, he's a little bit concerned, and he's like, basically exploring the idea of emergent church and all this kind of stuff. And he's coming from a place that's, he's not being defensive or attacking or anything like that, which is quite refreshing to me. I actually said to him, I said, you're one of the few people that I'm happy to have this kind of conversation with. But he was sort of bringing up the whole sort of view of the Bible, and I know there seems to be a very big sort of disconnect or difference, I don't know how you'd say it best, but, in the way that, the way that sort of the fundamental church would approach the Bible versus the way that someone like yourself would. So are you able to kind of elaborate on that or sort of speak to that idea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can tell you what I think about it and how I think it sometimes sits differently than the way some people from more conservative or fundamentalist religion approach it. First of all, I begin with the assumption that the Bible is not necessary. Okay, so you have to sort of hear me out on this one.
Even I'm holding my breath now.
Yeah. There was an entire expression of Jesus following. In fact, some that many of us would declare perhaps in its most vital stage before the canonized Bible was put together or accessible. Before, I would even say, it was even written. Before it even was experienced. Yeah. So the Gospels, the life of the disciples with Jesus was happening before those were written into Gospels. So they weren't utilizing the Gospels for their inspiration. And then when, the author of Luke or the author of John, who sort of identify themselves as being in a process writing their Gospels for a later group of people, declare why they're writing it, it's really great why they say they're writing the Gospels, right? The Gospel of John says, we've written these things so that you'll believe, and by believing you'll have life in his name. Well, so they're now saying, okay, for you in the second generation, we want you to have something that's similar to what we have, but there was a time where we didn't have it, now we do. So it's temporal, in other words, right? There's no other way. If you take the Gospel of John seriously, there's no other way to see it than temporal, it seems to me. And the writer of Luke is the same way. Dear Theophilus, many have taken an account to write these things down, but these things I've written to you so that you will have confidence in the stories that you've been told. Then you see a little bit of this in Paul's writing when he's then referring not to the Gospels nor to his own letters, but he's referring to the Jewish scriptures when he says, all scripture is God breathed and therefore profitable for teaching, for training, and for correction and for teaching, training, and correction in righteousness. I'm missing something in there, right? So Paul's idea in that little bit in Timothy is, hey, the scriptures that exist are to benefit us, and they help us in training and in living in righteousness. And he's just talking about the Old Testament, not even the New, right? So the Greeks weren't even reading the Old Testament. In fact, when Peter goes into Cornelius's house or when Paul goes to the Gentiles, they're not bringing with them the Jewish scriptures. They're not even carrying with them the Gospels that haven't been recorded yet and written down. They're bringing with them the testimony of their own lives and the power and the working of the Holy Spirit. So I just think we cannot have a Christian faith in 2015 that has a requirement different than the faith of the year 15. Because if we do, then we're just into a different expression of religion. And I know a lot of people, they have a dispensationalist view of Christianity that has these dispensations where there's a different set of requirements now than there was previously and all the rest of that. And I find it to be just an inconsistent way to proclaim the gospel. I would say the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead is the same spirit that's alive and active in you and I. So that's our commonality, is the work of God in the Spirit in the community of saints, not the records and the scriptures that have been written. In fact, I think the prophets say the same thing about the Hebrew scriptures. And Jesus is, bit about you have heard it said, but I say to you. Every one of his you have heard it said, but I say to you goes back and raises, he changes the understanding of something that's in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Old Testament, right? So he's not like, hey, you heard a couple of bad rumors. Let me kind of fix your mind on those bad rumors you heard. He's like, no, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, which Leviticus says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And he says, no, don't be like that. Be like this instead, right? So we're not supposed to. So anytime you begin with some assumption of this, right? So from that beginning point, that it cannot be a forever and always mandate for every person. Then you roll into that the history of people who can't access the Bible in the language that it's written in. Now I'm thinking the Ethiopian eunuch in the New Testament. The reason we've translated the Bible into all these different languages. Most countries where the Bible's been translated into a new language is because the faith already exists in people there before the Bible's put in that language, right? They're not translating the Bible first so people will have faith. They're translating it so people can have access to the scripture that encourages them as profitable for teaching and training and correction and righteousness, that matches the faith that they're already living. So we have it out of order at the start. And so so I think that's a beginning frame. And then from there, I like what, I use the language of the Bible as a living and active community member, and we should listen to it on every issue in which it has something to say, but treat it like every other respected community member, which really doesn't call us to diminish the Bible. It calls us to heighten the level to which we listen to one another. I like the way N.T. Wright speaks about it as sort of, writing the third act of a Shakespearean play after you've read the first two, that then our job is to continue and to keep going and writing it. But the viewpoint that the scripture is the beginning and the end of all faith, that's existed in multiple forms of religious fundamentalism through history and currently around the world. And, as we see in different faiths around the world, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism, fundamentalism causes people to live in ways that are really destructive to one another and to the planet. And I don't think we're in a neutral ground when it comes to people taking a fundamentalist view of religion. It's really insidious and does really, not to every single individual at the same level, but on the whole, it gives
Yeah.
excuse for a whole lot of really, really bad behavior. So I think we have to get rid of it. And almost every fundamentalist religion, I would say every fundamentalist belief, and I could be wrong, there might be some exception, but they all claim their scriptures to be above reproach and without external verification being needed.
Yeah.
And once you're into that, then you're just, my dad can beat up your dad kind of child playground behavior.
Yeah. Well, that's what it seems to lead to, this whole it's like a race to be the most orthodox, and it's like,
Right.
It's nuts, man. It's just crazy.
You listen to, I spend a lot of time paying attention to and listening to reports on fundamentalist Islam in Syria and Iraq right now, and it's been going on for a long time. And boy, it sounds awfully similar to the way that a lot of Christians sort of approach their fundamentalism. They have a different object, a different scripture that they go to.
Yeah, but still the same.
The consequences are the same. The approach is very similar.
Yeah.
So if you're approaching it through a fundamentalist argument, it does look and sound awfully similar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in regards to even the whole concept of violence, like you can look at, like you've sort of listed off certain religious sects and things that obviously are doing some horrendous things, and there's this physical violence going on, and typically within the Western church you don't see a lot of people cutting people's heads off or anything crazy like that. But at the same time, I think there is a violence happening on a very subtle level where people are being cut off and they're losing. I know for me, and I mean, I know it's not just me that's been through it, but when I started reading books like yours and Brian McLaren's and things like that, I became fundamentally an outcast by a lot of my friends, They were obviously nice to me on a sort of surface level kind of thing, like, hey, how you doing, and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, it was just like, there was this almost unspoken word, like, you're not one of us anymore,
I'm not trying to make light of decapitation or people cutting other people's heads off or anything. That's terrible and horrible and never want it to happen. And I'm not trying to make a moral equivalent here. But when someone says, well, I'm never going to harm you, but just know that in the end, God is going to cut your head off.
Right.
That, I mean, that's not the same thing at all as someone physically doing it to another. That is worse than those claims. But when someone that you love, someone that you trust, someone that you respect, someone that in your social circle as a human being matters to you, a family member or a pastor or someone that you've given credence in your life to and can speak into your life in loving, caring ways, says to you, the God of the universe is now your enemy, and God's enemies will be destroyed at the hand of God. Man, the difference there is only slight, right? It's not enough of a difference. Like, that is really damaging to people. And the number of religious people who will say that, and not just in Christianity. I mean, there's Jewish fundamentalists who say this. There's Buddhist fundamentalists who say a version of this. There's Hindu and Muslim fundamentalists who talk like this. So it's a fundamentalist thing. In fact, I would say it's one of the signs that someone is operating in a destructive fundamentalist pattern when they will declare that another person is the enemy of God. And man, there's a fine line, I think, in our human mind, in our human capacity, between someone is an enemy of God and that person should be an enemy of mine. My friend Jay Baker has this great statement that he uses when people want to ask him about hell. And he says, look, if my friend dies and stands before Jesus or stands before God and God won't forgive the person, even though the person is God's enemy, I'm just going to say, God, couldn't you practice what Jesus preached and love your enemies?
Yeah. Oh, man,
right?
That's so good.
Why does Jesus call us to love our enemies and to bless those who persecute us, but God doesn't do the same thing?
Yeah. I said the same. I said exactly the same thing to Kevin on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean that's a real that is a real question to ask. I'm like, I kind of wonder if, Mark, when you were standing on a street corner, I don't know the kinds of things you had said, but if I would have said to you, hey, if I'm an enemy of God, why can't God follow Jesus's command and love me even though I'm his enemy, and do good to me and bless me with heaven even though I'm his enemy? Why can't he live up to Jesus' standard? How would you have responded to something like that? Do you know? Do you have a sense?
That's an interesting. I'm glad you kind of threw that at me. Yeah, I suppose. I mean, given the being in the sort of stream of theology I was in, with Ray Comfort and Todd Friel and that, basically the approach was, basically the core message is we're all rebels, like we've all rebelled against God. We've broken his law. Like, they talk about the 10 Commandments. So you've lied, you've stolen,
Yeah.
you've looked at, and you go into the New Testament, Jesus says, if you look with lust, you've committed adultery and that kind of thing. And so that was basically the premise was, and I cringe now even explaining it. So thanks for making
Sure.
me relive that. But it is essentially telling someone you're a piece of shit.
Yeah. What Jesus seems to do is Jesus seems to take away the consequence for that sensibility, right? Like, hey, sure, someone wrongs you, they're your enemy, but treat them as if they're not. So why when you were in that world did you all not say, okay, you become an enemy of God, you do that your little taxonomy with the Old Testament and yada yada yada, and then say, but as it turns out, what God says is bless your enemies and do good to those who persecute you, so that's what God's going to do to you, is to bless you and do good to you, even though you're an enemy of God. Why don't they continue that thought with Jesus' command that people should do that? Why?
Because the whole logic is flawed.
I
mean, the whole logic is basically, instead of saying you should be attracted to the gospel and to God because he's compassionate, gracious, loving, it's you need to see how wrong you are, how bad you are, and then that's going to make you magically love Jesus, pretty much.
Yeah, because the thing, and I talk about this a bit in the Christianity Worth Believing book more than I do in Flipped, but it seems to me the good news of the gospel is that the consequence of sin is not what we've been told. That sin may be a common experience to human beings, but it doesn't separate us from God, because nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not heights or depths or anything. And I just find it so incredible that people will proclaim at one side this kind of ever-growing, everlasting grace of God to you if you say the right thing, but that's only available if you do something to sort of activate that. Like, I don't know. Because that doesn't seem to compute anywhere in there. So
there was just kind of I read sort of the first chapter of Flipped. Obviously, you had some free downloads available.
Yes, I still do on the website. There's changing chapters all the time. Yeah.
So basically, one of the things you said was flips don't force us to think in a new way. Rather, they conspire with thoughts that are already in our head. And that was something that really resonated with me in a lot of ways. I guess, to use example, when I, back in 2011, when I read, Love Wins, that, coming from that sort of, as I say again, that sort of evangelistic place, when I read that book, it didn't necessarily, it wasn't like a new idea. It wasn't like, oh, this is great. Like, I didn't know this before. It was, I think there's certain ideas, and it's not even like a proposition of truth, like this is true and you have to agree with it. It's like, I think what came through in that book was like, the heart of God for mankind, and saying God is for you, God is on your side. And it's like, it just resonated with me. And I think it's something that goes beyond just intellectual logic and reasoning. I think there's something in our I don't know, our soul, I guess is the right word, I don't know, but that we hear these truths, about the universe that we live in, and we're just like, yeah, that's true, and you can find it all over the place. And I think that's one thing, and I know you probably get in trouble for it as well, but I know Rob Bell does as well, where, he sort of finds truth all over the place, and he's quoting all these people and books and things that aren't quote unquote Christian at all, but he's like, truth is I think he actually says it in Velvet Elvis, where he says that we can claim truth wherever we find it, sort of thing. Yeah,
well, Mark, thank you for the conversation. It's sure Sure, a blast.
Yeah,
I
it was
appreciate it.
really good to talk to you, Doug. It was awesome, and maybe have you on again in the future when you've got another book out or something.
I would love to do that. Or next time we'll do that when I'm in town some point.
Cool.
I've got to get myself to New Zealand. It's some week in my life, so let's make that happen, and we'll sit down together.